Redshift has some very cool features that allow you to do some post-render processing on the final image. And I briefly mentioned these before when we were discussing some of the color space controls. And if we go to the gear icon here to open up the settings, you can see we have some post effects down here that we can turn on. And for this project, I just used the bloom and the flare. Of course, you can feel free to experiment with the others if you'd like. And for the bloom, the threshold here will determine how bright an area has to be subject to this bloom effect. And the softness, of course, is how blurred out that bloom effect will be. And of course, this is extremely heavy-handed here. We don't want anything nearly that extreme for this bloom effect. So something like this seems pretty reasonable. And the flare has some similar controls for the threshold. Looks like if we take this down pretty low, we get some very extreme effects. At this point, I would just leave the flare pretty subtle, and once you start adding some brighter elements like the explosions and fires, you may find yourself wanting to play around with these flare controls a bit more. And of course, you could apply some of these post effects in compositing instead. But if you like the convenience and the results of including it in the Redshift renders themselves, there's nothing wrong with doing that. However, if you want the flexibility to pick and choose whether you have the post effects applied or not, we can add an AOV to store the raw beauty render without these post effects applied. And it's been a commonly requested feature from Redshift users that they add an AOV that will store just the post effects. So that would be an AOV that just stores the bloom component, the flare component, and etc. At this point, we don't have that available, but if we go to our Redshift ROP, then we can add an AOV that will store the beauty render without those post effects applied. So let's add an additional AOV here, and then scroll down to that one, and we can select the beauty. You can see that the name of this beauty pass is Beauty Aux. And then reopening our render view, you can see that our standard beauty layer has these post effects applied to it. But if you select this Beauty Aux AOV, this has the exact same image without those post effects applied. So it's a totally valid and convenient workflow to dial in some post effects you'd like, but also include this Beauty Aux just in case you're wanting to revise some of those extra effects and you don't need to re-render the entire image to do so. And when you have both this Beauty Aux and this beauty with the post effects, there is a technique to isolate just the bloom and flare components where you can take this beauty render and then in compositing, you can subtract the Beauty Aux. And what that will leave you is just this extra component that's being added by those post effects. Another post effect that I did experiment with using was this photographic exposure. And this can be pretty interesting. It gives you a lot of extra controls over the image based on, real world camera properties. But using this does kind of break our beauty versus beauty aux workflow, because you can see now with this photographic exposure applied, that won't be included in our beauty aux AOV. So turning on this photographic exposure here will ruin that workflow where we can subtract the beauty aux from the beauty render to isolate this bloom and flare component there. And it's also kind of interesting that this photographic exposure isn't purely a post-processing effect. And this is something I didn't realize for a while, but this photographic exposure will actually affect the sampling that Redshift does during the actual rendering of the image. Because when rendering, you might be sampling these hot spots and dark spots and etc. a bit differently. And because this is listed with the post effects, you might reasonably assume that it's a purely post-render color correction. But it does in fact affect the render sampling. So that's something to be aware of. But we do have some compositing alternatives to this that will, of course, be pure post-render processes. So instead of using the photographic exposure here, we can go over to Fusion, and Fusion has this awesome third-party plugin called Reactor, which allows you to install lots of other plugins. Reactor is freely available, and I highly encourage you to check it out and install it if you're a Fusion user. And when you open that up, you can see tons of different plugins that you can install. And one of these is a Redshift photographic exposure. So let's scroll down to those. And you can see you actually have a set of Redshift utilities here. Most of these I haven't played with. There's a Redshift camera extractor, there's vector flipper, and it has this Redshift photographic exposure. So let's close Reactor and add in the photographic exposure here. Let's connect our beauty render to that. And now we get the same thing applied in compositing here. And I'm pretty sure there's a Nuke equivalent for this tool as well. Perhaps there's an equivalent in other programs. And it's my personal preference to do this at the compositing stage for extra flexibility here. As I mentioned before, when doing it in your actual Redshift renders, this will affect the sampling of the image. But for my use cases so far, I've found it just fine to apply it in our compositing instead. And that flexibility is generally more important to me than any difference in the sampling that this might apply at render time in Redshift. Now, while we are talking about compositing here, I can quickly show you that workflow to subtract the beauty aux from the beauty to get just the post effects component. So I'm going to pull in one of my creature renders here, and let's display that. And I'm going to make this alpha solid. And to access the extra channels in this EXR image for those AOVs, I'm going to right click and go to Script, and there's this HOS Split EXR Ultra, which is something I've installed via Reactor. So if we select that and hit OK, this will create additional loaders for the extra channels stored in this render right here. The color channel is an extra ID pass I had made. We don't really need that one, so I'll just pull that aside. So we have our main beauty render with post effects and the beauty aux without it. And we can subtract this with a channel boolean. Let's connect the background to our original render, the one with the post effects, and the foreground to the beauty aux without them. Let's display the channel booleans and set the operation to subtract. And we don't want this to do anything to the alpha, so I'm just going to set the alpha to do nothing. And there we go. Now we have this flare and bloom component from our original render here. And of course, this gives you more control if you want to do additional processing on these post-effect elements. But if you just want to blend these post-effects up or down a bit, there's a bit of an easier way where we can just merge one of those renders over the other. So if we just drop in a merge, connect the foreground to the render with the post effects, background will be the AOV without them. And if we display that, go to the merge, and we can just blend in those post effects if you want to dial those up and down a bit. And all of these extra ways of controlling and finessing the final image can be really helpful when you really want to get in there and tweak this final output. And before finishing up this video on post effects, just want to point out one more thing that I briefly mentioned in a previous video, and that is the fact that these post effect controls are stored on the camera. So if you have different shots where you want different amounts of bloom and flare and etc., you'll just have to make sure that you have unique cameras with all of those parameters set. And on the camera, you'll find that under Redshift camera and OCIO/post effects, you can see all of those post effect controls here. And these are linked to the render view as well. So if you change the settings here, it'll change them on the camera, and changing them in the camera parameters will update them in the render view here as well. So if we change the bloom threshold here, you can see that's changing on the camera. But actually, if we change the bloom threshold on the camera parameters here, this will be updated in the render view, but you will need to kick off a new Redshift render before these parameters are updated visually here. So you can see now that I'm re-rendering, this bloom threshold parameter has updated to match what I've set on that camera. And once you have this running IPR render, then these changes to the camera parameters will be instantly updated on the render view for Redshift as well.